Thank you, Sydney. John K. Bush is a circuit judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. His chambers are in Louisville, Kentucky. Prior to joining the court, Judge Bush was a partner in the Louisville office of Bingham Greenbaum Dahl LLP, where he also was co-chair of the firm's litigation department. He began his legal practice in the Washington, D.C. office of Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher LLP. Judge Bush served as a law clerk for Judge J. Smith Henley of the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. He graduated summa cum laude from Vanderbilt University in 1986 and cum laude from Harvard Law School in 1989.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be with you. And Sydney, I appreciate your remarks as well. I'm familiar with your law school from many experiences, not the least of which is that my son Christian is a 1L. And so I've been able to actually see you all up close and personal earlier this year and helping move in Christian. But it's a great honor to be with you. You have a great reputation around the country. And I just wanted to indulge you tonight with one of my pet topics, which may or may not interest you, but if you can bear with me, I'm happy to answer questions at the end regarding my topic or any other thing you'd like to ask me. I'm happy to chat with you. But what I'm going to do now is pull up my PowerPoint, which will get me started. Bear with me. There we go. So my topic is a founder we should not cancel. And I'm afraid perhaps the publicity gave away who that founder is, but I'll pretend like for those of you who don't know, I won't tell you who it is just quite yet. You may think that my topic has something to do with this fellow, but no, I throw him in. He's certainly a founder that's worth knowing about and not canceling. But no, George Mason is not the founder I have in mind this evening. What got me to thinking about giving this topic tonight is that I've been working on a book about the founder that I'm talking about for many years now. And one of the themes of the book has really come into focus really in the past year. And that is the theme that the story of America tends to repeat itself. Now, obviously, there are not exact parallels between happenings of today and what's happened in our past, but I do think that there are some interesting analogies that can be made and understandings. And for me, the reassurance is that as much as today's headlines may seem surreal or totally unheard of, oftentimes you can find parallels earlier in American history. And I use the examples. Obviously, pandemic has been on our mind throughout this last year. Our country's been through numerous pandemics, including the founding era. Many things happened: the yellow fever, smallpox, that had much, as tuberculosis, that had much more devastating effects, in fact, than COVID has had. So our country has survived these challenges through the years. And of course, the events of January 6th has been on everyone's mind since that time. And I've reflected on those. So the founder that was, that's the topic tonight, was alive the last time that the Capitol was under siege. And of course, that would have been the War of 1812. And not only was the Capitol invaded, but it was burned to the ground. And so was the White House and many other buildings in Washington, D.C. It put obviously a huge stress on the country. And the insurrections in that era, you read the accounts of things that happened, the Shays Rebellion, Whiskey Rebellion. There are parallels to protests or insurrections that occur today. For instance, Shays Rebellion, there were farmers in Western Massachusetts who would occupy state courthouses to protest for their various grievances, tax related and debt related for the most part. So in a weird way, it gives me some reassurance that we're going to survive and thrive, notwithstanding whatever challenges face our country today. Now, in the Capitol, there's this painting of the artist is Howard Chandler Christie, and this was actually commissioned in the 1940s, and it hangs in the eastern stairwell of the House of Representatives, and you can see it's a rendition of the founders at the signing of the Constitution. You oftentimes see the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but this is a rendition of that event. And the founder I'm talking about is in this picture. You wouldn't know where he is, but I'll give you a hint. It's that fellow right there, standing by the window. Now, the way the artist rendered him in this portrait, you don't really know all there is about this founder. And in fact, the most important thing you don't know about him is that he's actually missing a leg. So that's the founder we're talking about, and it's Gouverneur Morris. Now, there is some dispute over how do you pronounce his first name. I know Richard Brookhiser wrote a book about him a few years ago, and he says that the way you pronounce it is Gouverneur Morris. For better lack of probably not having had enough experience pronouncing his name, I tend to call him Gouverneur. But regardless, you'll know who I'm talking about. So he's the founder who has the peg leg, the one that's his notable physical characteristic. So why is he an important founder? And so before we get into canceling of Gouverneur Morris or why he should not be canceled, first of all, let's talk about a little bit about who he was and what he accomplished. The first thing he did of great note was that he was an advocate for Washington's troops. He was on the committee sent by the Continental Congress to Valley Forge to assess the condition of the troops and to coordinate getting them supplies and provisions to make it through that winter at Valley Forge. And I tend to view Valley Forge as a very important event for the founding of the country and actually for constitutional law, because many of the principal leaders in our early republic, including, of course, George Washington was there, but there are many others, including John Marshall, of course, becomes the great Chief Justice, who advocates, or not advocates, but interprets the Constitution in a way that allows for a powerful central government or general government. And I would contend that Valley Forge was really where it all began, because it was the conditions that brought this diverse group of individuals from all of the colonies who were then newly formed states, brought them together so that they, as Marshall put it, I was no longer a Virginian, I was now an American. And Valley Forge was where that bond was formed. And so Gouverneur Morris was there at Valley Forge. He was not part of the Army, but he was able to understand their conditions and advocate for them. Now, the next important event for Gouverneur Morris was his involvement in the Constitutional Convention. It's normally understood that James Madison is, quote, the father of the Constitution. But I would contend that Gouverneur Morris has a large claim to the text of the Constitution, because he was on the Committee of Style. He was given the responsibility by that committee to come up with the actual wording that is used in the Constitution. That committee took 23 resolves that had come from the Committee of Detail at the end of the debate of the Constitution, and Gouverneur crafted those 23 resolves into an elegant 7-article document that became the Constitution. He came up with the wording of such things as the vesting clauses of Article 1, 2, and 3. He came up with the phraseology that at times is specific, but other times is capacious. And I would say by design. He understood that there were certain concepts that needed to be more broadly stated to be interpreted. And of course, he was the author of the famous preamble of the Constitution, which is, while it doesn't necessarily have a binding force as the rest of the document does, as a preface to the document, but it does have certainly a moral force and an inspirational force for a country. After the Constitutional Convention, the next big event in Gouverneur's life was that he became the American minister to France. He was the successor to Thomas Jefferson in that role, arrived in France in 1789, and then he served, Gouverneur served as the minister in the early 90s, 1790s that is, and he was there when the Reign of Terror began in France. It was a very tumultuous time. For those who studied the French Revolution, you know what a horrific time it was. And Gouverneur Morris was the man on the ground, the American who stayed in Paris when all the most of the other diplomats from the other countries fled the city. He stayed there. He was a faithful correspondent to Washington as to the events in France. He was very influential for Washington in persuading him to maintain a policy of neutrality between France and England when individuals such as Jefferson and other Republicans, when I say Republican, I'm referring to the Jeffersonian Republicans, but other Republicans would have advocated trying to side with France over England in their rivalry, but Gouverneur Morris was advocating for a neutrality because he was, for one thing, it wasn't clear to him who was going to end up on top in the revolution that occurred, and of course the guillotining of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. By the way, Gouverneur Morris, while he was in France, ended up becoming an informal advisor to Louis XVI, which some say he overstepped his role as an American minister to get into that position. But he actually stored the king's treasure at the American legation in Paris and tried to work on some escape plans to try to get Louis and Marie Antoinette and the royal family out of France. And one of them would have been to actually have them transported to America to save their lives. But he was not successful in doing that. He was successful, however, in sheltering many aristocrats who had aided America in the American Revolution, who are now in Paris, who would otherwise have lost their lives. And he was a shelter for them during that period. He returned to this country in 1799, the turn of the century into the 1800s, and he was urged by his friend Alexander Hamilton to get involved in politics. Initially, he was reluctant to get back into the political fray, but he was elected by the New York state legislature to be a United States senator from New York in 1802. And so he served for a couple of years in the United States Senate, where he was a strong advocate for an independent judiciary. He opposed the Republican repeal of the Federalist Judiciary Act, and which reduced the number of federal judges. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the talk. And then a couple of other interesting things he did after that. He went back to New York, which was his home territory, and he was appointed to the commission that actually came up with a street grid for New York City. So the fact that New York is a succession of squares, the matrix of Manhattan is really attributed to, you can attribute it to Gouverneur Morris. There's actually a story that he and his other commissioners were once walking around lower Manhattan, and they came upon a gravel site where some workers were getting gravel out of a stream, and there was a screen that the workers were using that either he sat down on the gravel or fell over, and the reflection of the light from the sun went through the screen, and he saw the squares, and he said, "That's the design." And it was a brilliant idea because it created a real efficiency of the design of the city to maximize the space for obviously a really expensive piece of real estate. So you see such a contrast between the way New York looks versus, say, a city like Washington, D.C., which didn't follow that pattern. But you can attribute that to Gouverneur Morris's inspiration. Secondly, he was a commissioner on the Erie Canal Commission, and the Erie Canal is not as important today, but in its era, it was a very important innovation which linked New York City with the Great Lakes and established New York City as a trading capital of the U.S. So he did all these great things. So the question is, why was he canceled? And when I say canceled, I'm saying, I dare say I won't take a hand count today, but probably most people on today's call don't know who Gouverneur Morris is or haven't even thought about him. And you certainly wouldn't think about him as being that important compared to Alexander Hamilton or of course, James Madison. Why was he canceled? Well, one reason was he was a bad boy, and he was the bad boy of the founders. He rivaled Franklin for let's say extracurricular activities. He was the last founder to be married. He didn't marry until he was like 57. But he had numerous affairs in America and also over in Europe. So that was one reason why he was just kind of considered a little bit too scandalous to be considered, mainstream of the founders. These are some of the things that have been said about him. Some of the contemporaries, Roger Sherman called him a profane and irreligious man. Many people said he wasn't serious enough. He didn't take himself that seriously. He liked to joke, had a great sense of humor. He used these words himself to call himself an incautious man. Richard Henry Lee called him a flutterer on the surface. In other words, he, not really having the gravitas necessary to be a great leader. He had a superiority complex. He was a very smart guy. He's probably the smartest person in the room at the Constitutional Convention, but he let everyone know that too. So that didn't really make a lot of friends. He was also an elitist. He was distrustful of popular opinion. He thought that there was a natural aristocracy in America, just as there is in every country, and that I think he would say it was naive to believe that you could make decisions based upon what, as he called it, the mob would dictate. And he certainly saw an evidence of that when he got to France and he saw the excesses of the French Revolution. But these are probably the three, these points are probably the real reason why he was relegated to the backbench of the founders. The War of 1812. So what happened in the War of 1812? Well, the war itself, historians have questioned the need for the war, at least more recently, because it was a war against Great Britain that probably didn't need to be fought. It was ostensibly over the impressment of sailors, of British sailors that had joined American ships, and the British would impress them back into their navy because they needed more sailors for their ships. But that was one reason for the war, which that's a legitimate reason to protect new Americans who had been British sailors. But Gouverneur would say that the reason the war really took place was two reasons. One was to conquer Canada, to get more land for America and Canada. And then the second reason was that the Southern senators wanted to expand territory for slavery. And one thing I haven't talked about Gouverneur Morris so far, but one thing that really makes him stand out amongst the founders is that he was virulently against slavery. He was the one founder at the Constitutional Convention who made the most strident remarks against the institution of slavery and did not want slavery to be memorialized or sanctioned by the Constitution. He obviously didn't succeed on that score, but we'll talk about a little bit. He did do some things that were noteworthy to allow the country ultimately to abolish slavery and move forward. The other thing that happened at the War of 1812 was something called the Hartford Convention. And this was a gathering of New England states and it was New England, but there was also some talk of New York joining with New England. These were delegates that met in Hartford, Connecticut to discuss how to respond to the War of 1812. The Northern Federalists were very upset about the war because of the reasons I've talked about, that they thought were immoral for fighting this war. They also thought it was boneheaded to be, going against England and thereby aiding France, which at that point was being run by Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon was, of course, an emperor who had become sort of a dictator in France, who was, attacking everyone in Europe. And so the Federalists were saying, this is crazy to be trying to weaken the power, England, that is the only force left that can defeat Napoleon. So anyway, they met in Hartford and they planned a northern succession from the Union. So it's, in a way, the War of 1812, the Northerners were that this was the lost cause of the North. This was the Northern attempt to succeed from the Union, which of course predates the Southern attempt in the Civil War. Gouverneur Morris was not at the Hartford Convention, but in his letters, he expressed much support for the aims of that convention. And so I think that this is probably the main reason why he was canceled, because obviously the War of 1812 ended with an American victory, or at least the Treaty of Ghent, which was a peace which brought very favorable terms for America. And after the war, there was the Battle of New Orleans, where, of course, Andrew Jackson prevailed. And I just think after the War of 1812, those who had supported the Hartford Convention were pariahs. And by extension, the Federalists had supported the Hartford Convention. They became the pariah party. And you'll see that there were only, I think Rufus King ran maybe one more time as the Federalist presidential candidate in 1816. And I think that was the last time we had a Federalist actually even run for president, and the party just went away. So I think this is the main reason why Gouverneur Morris gets a bad rap, because he did support this secessionist movement. But it's interesting to compare Gouverneur Morris's treatment with his friend Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton, in fact, was a very good friend of Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur was the man tapped to give the eulogy for Hamilton at his funeral. And Gouverneur also raised money for Hamilton's destitute widow and children after Hamilton was killed in the duel. But of course, there's no Gouverneur Broadway musical. And in fact, I don't believe there's any mention of Gouverneur at all in Hamilton, the musical, despite the fact that he was Hamilton's best friend. And, one of the reasons why Gouverneur is not mentioned perhaps, and also is not as well known in history, is that he actually turned down Hamilton's offer to help write the Federalist Papers. So if there's one big mistake in Gouverneur's life in terms of being well known, perhaps this was it, that he didn't, he had better things to do than to write the Federalist Papers. So we've heard the negatives about Gouverneur. Now I want to talk about the positives, which is why Gouverneur Morris should not be canceled. So what did he do? His contributions to the Constitution. We're just now beginning to see scholarship as to his involvement in the Constitution and what he did. William Traynor of Georgetown, I believe, a professor there, did a piece last year on Gouverneur Morris, where he called him the dishonest scrivener. And what does he mean by that? He's saying, well, he ostensibly was supposed to just be doing the style of the Constitution, but Traynor argues that Gouverneur Morris actually was making some substantive changes that he kind of slipped by the other delegates that got into the Constitution. And obviously, there were things that were right in front of them, but the particular wording that Gouverneur chose for certain things today will affect how we interpret provisions of the Constitution. And so I would say that in a way, we might learn more about an original meaning of the Constitution by really studying Gouverneur Morris's contribution more, I would say, even than James Madison or Alexander Hamilton, because those guys obviously wrote the Federalist Papers, but they weren't the people who actually wrote the Constitution. That was Gouverneur Morris. The opposition to slavery, I think, is the one thing that he can be most proud of, his legacy, because he did stand up against having slavery in the Constitution. He did not succeed with respect to, obviously, the 3/5 clause was in there. There are references to the allowing the slave trade to continue, international slave trade until, I believe, 1808 or 1809. But one thing that he did do in wording the Constitution is there is a conspicuous absence of the word slave or slavery or anything relating to slavery explicitly in the Constitution. He always uses the words persons or other persons, and he doesn't refer to slaves as property. And he also, one of the other interesting things about the document is that as far as gender goes, he uses he to describe individuals, but it's used in a generic sense, and there's nothing written in the Constitution which limits the ability to be president or other offices to just men. So actually, you had a situation where you could have elected women to be a woman to be president even before women got the right to vote. So I think it's a pretty interesting the way he did that. And of course, the way he designed the vesting clauses of the articles 1, 2, and 3, the choice of wording, he was a strong advocate for executive power. He wanted the president to be directly elected by the people. That was opposed. And then he eventually worked on the compromise that resulted in the Electoral College. He was in favor of direct election of members of Congress. He was not for the New Jersey plan. He was more of a Virginia plan supporter. Of course, being from New York, his interests would have been similar with Virginia. But what you find throughout the debate is he'll take positions on various things. He may not always win, but then he'll modify his views to try to get the best result he can out of given the situation that's presented to him. He was a very good deal maker, And also he was able to articulate in the best way he could take, even if he lost the debate, he would at least be able to use the best wording he could come up with to put it in the document, whatever has been agreed upon, in a way that is more defensible than it would have been if he had not been involved in the drafting process. And then finally, judicial power. He was a strong advocate for an independent judiciary. He was a lawyer himself. He understood the importance of judges not being at the mercy of the legislative branch. That was a reason why he opposed the Republican Judiciary Act, which what they called unpacking of the courts. And what was happening was the Federalists had appointed, or were attempting, of course, to appoint, we know from Marbury versus Madison, they didn't always get the commissions delivered on time, but the Federalists had tried to get as many judges as they could on the court, the Supreme Court, and also on the lower courts. And then the Republicans unpacked the courts, so they reduced the number of federal judges and actually were involved in early impeachments of federal judges, including Samuel Chase, the only Supreme Court justice to be impeached. He was not convicted, but Gouverneur was opposed to those early impeachment efforts to attack federal judges. So was Gouverneur an originalist? It's a really interesting question. I can tell you this: he would not have been an intent originalist. He would have to be an original meaning type of way of interpreting. It's hard to say for people at the founding era how they would approach a constitutional issue today in terms of originalism, because they were all present when they signed the document. So it's probably not as self-evident to them what the issues could be many years down the road and looking at the document. But I thought this was an interesting quote about what he thought about how it's hard couldn't recollect exactly, what they might have thought when they came up with certain wording. I think from his perspective, I think he would say you need to focus on the words themselves and query whether he would have as much reliance upon the Federalist Papers, given that he didn't think it was even worth his time to write any of the Federalist Papers. I think he might think of them more as not propaganda, but advocacy, which may or may not necessarily reflect intent of the framers. He also had a very interesting change of heart right before he died. He died in 1816. So he went through this process of the War of 1812. He was very partisan. He had earlier, of course, been close with Madison. He becomes very much opposed to Madison. And he's also, at one point, was very close to Jefferson. He becomes a diehard opponent of Jefferson during the war. So Jefferson and Madison are on one side. Gouverneur Morris and the other Federalists are on the other side. But after the war, when the Federalists have lost, he writes this letter to some Federalists in Philadelphia. And I think it's just a really interesting quote. He talks about, "Let us forget party and think of our country. That country embraces both parties. We must endeavor, therefore, to save and benefit both." And he goes on, but he really comes to this realization that I don't think he's saying that you abandon your principles of your party, but he's saying that you've got to listen to the other side, and you can't just have as your goal to eliminate the other side, because I think he believes that there are always going to be a left and a right in American politics. And that's just the way we will operate. And it will be necessary to have both sides represented in the debate in order for the country to progress. And then, as I was pointing to earlier, I think Gouverneur Morris is interesting in that he, more than perhaps any other founder, was open to persuasion. And this is James Madison. As I said, Madison, he knew Madison. He wrote this about Gouverneur Morris in the 1830s. So this was after Gouverneur had died. He was writing it to a guy named Jared Sparks, who was the president of Harvard, who was writing biographies about different founders. And so Jared Sparks writes Madison and says, "What do you think about Gouverneur Morris? What's he like?" And he gave this as part of the answer that Madison gave. And he basically says, this guy was very smart, but he had something that was very rare among people. And that's where, if the lights of discussion satisfy him that his opinions have been too hastily formed, he was willing to change his mind. Gouverneur Morris also, he's a contradiction in that he was he had a wild life. He was a scandalous guy, but he also had this religious belief in him. He was an Anglican, became Episcopalian. He did believe in God, and he had this belief that religion was important for civil society to function properly. And it really came into focus for him when he was in Paris during the Reign of Terror. And of course, that regime was built upon an atheist dogma that really was, they were tearing down the statues at Notre Dame. They were declaring Notre Dame a temple to reason, and having a prostitute go in and, on the altar, and all sorts of crazy things that were going on in France. And so Gouverneur Morris, who was like the wildest guy in America, he writes, "I've kind of like regained my religion once I've gotten to France and see what's going on over here." And so this quote comes from late in life when he became the president of the New York Historical Society. And it's one of his addresses. He talks about how important religion is for civil society to function properly. Another thing that I find admirable about him is that he was loyal to his friends. I mean, Washington, he was friends for life. He was instrumental in persuading Washington to be the first president. He was instrumental in persuading Washington to go to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. He was very loyal to Hamilton. I've already talked about the things he did for Hamilton. And that was even when Hamilton was stabbing him in the back. There was an incident where Gouverneur Morris was sent by Washington to be a secret agent in London with the British government to try to smooth things over after the things that they weren't honoring their obligations under the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. They weren't giving over their forts and other things. And Hamilton really kind of badmouths Gouverneur to Washington and also Jefferson, and basically says Gouverneur Morris is not a really good negotiator. He doesn't know what he's doing. And what was going on was Hamilton was giving information about what Gouverneur Morris's talking points were to a British agent in America, who was then relaying that information back to the British government. So Gouverneur Morris was really acting at a disadvantage in London, ironically, by virtue of the bad mouthing that Hamilton was doing in America about him. So I don't know how much Gouverneur Morris really knew about behind the scenes what was going on with Hamilton, but it's really interesting that, and ultimately Hamilton, they become friends again and everything's good. But Gouverneur Morris did stand up for his friends. And as I mentioned also, he took care of friends in Paris who needed help, when their lives were on the line. He's also important because I think he's just a great model to how you live successfully with a disability. This guy, and I should tell the story about how he lost his leg. There was some stories saying he was supposedly jumping out of a window to escape a jealous husband of one of his lovers, but that's not actually what happened. He was in a carriage accident, and he fell out of the carriage and was trying to regain control of the horses, and the carriage wheels rolled over his leg. And carriage accidents, by the way, were very violent events. There are a lot of people that were injured in those days. But the doctors who looked at him, really probably gave him bad advice, but he had so many breaks and on his leg, and infection was setting in that they believed he needed to amputate. So they later another doctor said, his regular doctor who wasn't there said they shouldn't have amputated. But regardless, they amputated his leg. So this occurred in his late 20s. So for most of his life, he had a peg leg. But notwithstanding that, this guy, he was a great dancer. He would still continue dancing even with a peg leg, and he would walk like miles, 8 or 9 miles at a time, walk around his farm, and he would go up the steps of great cathedrals in Europe. It didn't slow him down. And so I think that's another reason he's really quite a model for us today. He was also a foreign policy realist. He just understood that, or in his view, you can't put the same model of government necessarily in every country, and every country has to make its own decisions as to what best suits its circumstances. And he was using this in the context mainly of France, because he understood, or at least he believed, France was not ready to go directly to the full-scale republic that America had because of this nobility, the nobility that were there, and of course the king, and they needed something different there than just imposing wholesale what had happened in America. I mean, you can debate whether his views are correct or not, but I would say today his views would be more subdued in assuming that American foreign policy necessarily we have to replicate exactly what we have in America and other countries. And as I mentioned earlier before, he was for an independent judiciary. He gave a couple of really long-winded speeches. He was very dramatic in the way he presented himself, but on the Senate floor, this is the conclusion of where he's saying not to pass the Republicans' Judiciary Act. Pause, for heaven's sakes, pause. He's just very dramatic. He's very passionate about his views that the judiciary should not be tampered with. And then, of course, his most famous line, I would say, a more perfect union, which, of course, is used all the time these days. But it's, of course, in the preamble. And a couple of really great quotes from Gouverneur Morris, which I think really go to this question that's been raised of, how legitimate are the founding, is the founding generation? Are they so, obviously the stain of slavery, does that make them so illegitimate that we cannot look to them as models? And I think he's quite modest. I mean, he's humble. He understands. He knows they're not perfect. And he says, while some have boasted that the Constitution is a work from heaven, others have given it a less righteous origin. I have many reasons to believe that the Constitution is the work of plain, honest men, and such, I think it will appear. Faulty it must be, for what is perfect? And then he has another quote, there's nothing perfect in this world, and we must therefore take things as we find them. He's very optimistic for America's future. At Valley Forge, there's a story that he would go on about how great America is going to be, the rising glories of America, and all the things that are coming in the future. And then he wrote a talk. I don't know if he ever gave this address, but I think it's a great quote where he talks about, I anticipate a day when to command respect in the remotest regions, it will be sufficient to say that I am an American. Our flag shall then wave in glory over the ocean, and our commerce feel no restraint but what our government may impose. Happy, thrice happy day. To reach this envied state, we need only will. Yes, my countrymen, our destiny depends on our will. But if we will stand high on the record of time, that will must be inflexible. So this brings me back to my original point about the Capitol and, how reflecting on what happened on January 6th. In a lot of ways, our American history the story of our country is a drama. And the question is, what will be our next act? And there's a great quote from Alexander Hamilton to Gouverneur Morris: "Let us both erect a temple to time, only regretting that we shall not command a longer portion of it to see what will be the event of the American drama." And then Gouverneur Morris has a great quote: "The event is in the hand of God." So that's all I have. I hope that provoked some thoughts, and I'm happy to answer any questions you all have. And I'm also happy to answer any questions just about my job or our court or anything else. So Sydney, I'll turn it back over to you if you have anything for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judge Bush. I know that we've all learned a lot from your lecture. We really appreciate you coming. I think we do have a couple questions in the chat. The first one, what do you think Gouverneur Morris's evaluation of the Constitution would be today?
I think he, like most founders, would probably be very surprised by the way it has been interpreted. I don't think, though, that he would be surprised that the country the way the country has developed. I would say that he would probably not be surprised that the general government, as they called the federal government in that era, has gained much more power at the expense of the state governments. Because I don't think Gouverneur Morris was that concerned with preserving state power. He was much more, he wrote the Constitution so that it was a compact between the individuals of the country. That's why he says "we the people" at the beginning instead of "we the states." He was not into the compact theory of states, I don't think. And so in that sense, the way the country has evolved, that the federal government has gained power at the expense of state governments, I don't think he'd be surprised by that.
Wonderful. The next question, do you know if he supported the Bill of Rights?
You know, he didn't. Initially, he didn't because he thought they were not necessary. He was of the Scalia school. I would say that he believed the structure of the original Constitution would protect rights. And so it was not really necessary to have the Bill of Rights. I don't think he opposed. I mean, I think he believed it as more as a belt and suspender thing, but I don't think he thought that they were really necessary. I'll give you one caveat on that. He was a strong advocate for freedom of the press. And so I guess I haven't read anything on his involvement in advocacy for the Bill of Rights, but I do know he supported his grandfather had been a judge on the New York courts who had ruled in favor of Peter Zenger, who was a colonist or an early printer who had criticized the royal governor Crosby. And I know Gouverneur always cited his grandfather as, as a great model for protection of freedom of the press. So I think, though, he would have understood that to be a protection, maybe not a protection that necessarily comes from the federal government, but something that would be protected at the state level on a state constitution.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question. Do you think that Morris's involvement in some of the debt speculation schemes after or during ratification had anything to do with his cancellation?
His involvement in the what?
In some of the debt speculation schemes.
Yeah. No, he was a businessman. He was I don't know that I would say his speculation was he was involved in trying to buy up all the American debt to France. He was trying in a syndicate, trying to buy that up, and it didn't succeed. But yeah, I think Jefferson would have, he called him a high-flying monarchy man. Jefferson thought that that Gouverneur was his business dealings. Some of them he thought were a little shady. So I think it's fair to say, yeah, some of that could have played into his perception.
Wonderful. Next question. And these are actually two questions that are tied together. The first one is, did he have any slaves? And secondly, did he see slavery as a potential sort of political division or as a source of moral division?
He inherited a slave from his father. His father had like 40 something slaves, 46 slaves, I believe. He inherited one from his father and then set that slave free. I don't know exactly when he did, but it would have been early in his life. And he, throughout his life, he bought some slaves, but his custom was to free the slave after buying him, and then he would pay wages to African Americans who worked on his farm. But I read one article that in one census, I think the census of 1810, recorded that there were 2 slaves at Morrisania, which was the name of his farm in Westchester County, New York. So I think technically, I think he did own slaves at various points, but I don't think it was I think it was a short period of time, and he freed all of them. So it was not like the Virginia planters who go their whole life owning the slaves and then free them when they die. It wasn't that situation. He was actually freeing them as he acquired them. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. I think we have one more. Do you have any favorite anecdote from Gouverneur Morris's life?
Oh God. There's a lot of anecdotes. A couple of them, and they may not be exactly true, but they're told about him. So I'll go ahead and tell them. One story is that he had a bet with Alexander Hamilton about George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton says, "Well, I will give you dinner with 12 of your friends with wine and great food if you'll go up and slap General Washington on the shoulder and tell him how glad you are to see him." And so supposedly Gouverneur Morris does that, and then George Washington turns at him with a cold stare, and he says he shrinks back and feels like the weight of the world is on him, and he can't. He would never take that bet up again, but he actually supposedly wins the bet and gets the dinner. So that's one anecdote. Another one is that when he's in Paris, his carriage is surrounded by the mob, and they think he's an aristocrat, and they're going to hang him up, kill him. And he supposedly opens the door of the carriage, takes his wooden leg off and waves it in the air, and he says, I'm not an aristocrat. I'm an American, and I've lost my leg in the cause of liberty. And that supposedly saves his life. So who knows if it's true or not? But that's one of the stories told.
That's great. Thank you. We did get one more question, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Okay. What is your favorite part? This is a more general question. What's your favorite part about being a federal court circuit judge?
What's my favorite part about being a federal circuit judge? I would say, let me give you a little background of what I did. I was in private practice for upwards of 20 something years before I became a judge. And when you're in practice, you have to, or at least in my practice, I was focusing on, the areas that I'm litigating for my clients. And one of the great freedoms of being a judge is that, or responsibilities also, is that you have to learn and become familiar again with all these other areas of law that you may have studied in law school, but may have not even thought about or looked at for a long time. So for me, the favorite part of being a federal judge is it gives you this both responsibility and really the freedom to be able to explore other areas of law that you may have neglected when you were practicing law, because you're only focused on whatever it is that your area of specialty is. And so I say it's kind of like the story of Rip Van Winkle, who slept for, I don't know, 20 years, missed the American Revolution, wakes up and sees what happened to America during the Revolution. I analogize myself to Rip Van Winkle because I was in practice for 20 something years. I slept through what was going on in the academy and everything else in American law. You wake up and then you realize you're able to see all the things that have happened in areas of law that you would have studied in law school, constitutional law, and whatnot. Obviously, I was following it as I went along, but not with the depth that you get to do as a federal judge. And so it's been fun. It's like going back to law school in a way, to be a judge, because you're able to, and also the clerks bring that renewal of what's going on in the law schools to your chambers, so you're able to learn, what's important now, what's being taught, which may or may not align with what I was being taught, back when. So anyways, just the opportunities to learn other areas of law and to apply that as part of my job.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Judge Bush. We finished up with all the questions. I will give an interesting piece of trivia for today, though. Our live stream of this was actually banned off of Facebook. We just found out. We're going to be, yes, our live stream of this event has been banned off of Facebook.
Why is that?
Apparently I just got a couple texts from our tech people. It has violated the copyright of the Middle Eastern Broadcast Service. So Facebook has decided to pull this. We've had no issue with this before. We're going to be appealing this. We're going to see how we can work this out with FedSoc Nationals as well. But we will hopefully get this uploaded to our live stream. We'll get this live stream uploaded to our Facebook as soon as possible. I apologize for the people who attempted to view this on Facebook. We will be working on this as quickly as possible. So besides that irony, I want to thank everyone today who has joined us. I want to give a huge thank you to Judge Bush for his insightful and very wonderful talk. We'd love to have you come speak again for our chapter.
Well, hopefully next time it'll be.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Judge, and thank you to everyone who joined tonight. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.